Virtual reality is pretty spectacular. I think the first time I tried VR was at PAX 2016, but the first time I tried it sober was when I set up the Valve Index I pre-ordered in 2019. I remember setting it up, playing around with it a bunch, and then whoops, it's 3 in the morning. The best layman description of VR I've ever heard is that it's like headphones for your eyes. The visual immersion that provides is just unmatched. But the current state of VR is one of controversy in gaming circles. In part, I suspect, because of the fear of missing out, but most VR critics point to the barrier of entry. Because VR headsets aren't cheap, and most of them require very powerful PCs on top of that to actually run your games. So you'll always hear critics arguing that VR is just a gadget for rich people. But the issue with this criticism is that it's focused entirely on the hardware when we should be focusing on VR software. Of course, modern headsets are bulky, a pain in the ass to set up, uncomfortable after you're wearing them for several hours. But the hardware is obviously going to get slimmer and cheaper over time because that's what hardware technology does. And once that happens, once everybody has access to much more affordable VR displays, the software that everybody's playing will still be based on the software we're using right now. Someday people will be playing today's VR games using VR technology that hasn't even been invented yet. Do you remember the beginning of James Cameron's Titanic? There is actually a VR headset in that movie. They use it to control one of the underwater robots.
Go, flip it over, go. Turn over, keep going, go. Okay, drop it.
I'm not sure if that technology actually existed in 1997 or if it was just in the movie for spectacle, but if it did, it would have cost tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. Today, an Oculus Quest 2 is $300. But while I'm on the topic of James Cameron, I'd like to point out that the current state of VR technology would be nowhere near where it is today were it not for James Cameron's Avatar. You know, the movie with the blue people. You might not recall, but back in 2009 when Avatar came out, Real D 3D was all the rage in movie theaters. And in order to film Real D 3D, filmmakers had to record with 2 cameras, approximately 64 millimeters apart. But when they were filming the CG parts of Avatar, it was much easier. They just needed to duplicate the camera, slide it over the same distance, and then boom, you have digital stereoscopic vision. You see, the reason we have 2 eyes is because those 2 eyes can perceive something from slightly different angles, and the brain uses that data to perceive depth. So when you're wearing a VR headset, each eye is seeing the same scene but slightly offset from each other. And this convinces your brain that you're actually seeing depth in your digital environment. And what this technology enables is for humans to experience things that they can never fully comprehend before. We've all seen pictures and videos of whales on distant TV and computer screens, but with VR, that screen melts away and you're in it. You feel like you're actually standing next to this enormous whale. Think of all of the use cases for this technology. Imagine seeing enormous Arctic glaciers collapsing in front of you rather than seeing some drone video from a mile away. But moving on to video games. Officially, VR headsets released in 2016 and lots of developers started making games for them. But most of them were indie developers that were just starting to scratch the surface of the types of gameplay that VR enables us to do. When we talk about video game consoles, we often refer to something called system sellers. A system seller is the kind of game that makes consumers want to purchase the console primarily for that game. Think games like Halo or God of War or Breath of the Wild. Games that are so highly regarded, you'll fork over $300 or more to buy the hardware necessary to play that game. And for quite a while, the VR scene was in desperate need of that killer game. In 2020, that killer game came out. It's called Half-Life Alyx, and it's developed by Valve Software. You see, Valve, for better or for worse, is putting quite a few eggs in the VR basket. And this kind of game could never have happened without somebody taking those kinds of risks. Now, being the first Half-Life game in like 15 years, lots of users that do not have VR were desperate to play it, and so it was only a matter of days before people had decompiled the game and created a version of it that you can play normally, like a normal Half-Life game. But those players quickly discovered that if you're playing Half-Life Alyx outside of VR, it's pretty fucking boring. Because Half-Life Alyx was designed completely around virtual reality. Almost every interaction takes this into account. Look here, this is how you interact with a health dispenser in Half-Life Alyx. Your controllers are being tracked as analogs for your hand, so you actually have to reach out and interact with these things. Compare that to how you interact with the health dispenser in Half-Life 2. So this is called VR-centric design. And if you're making a game exclusive to VR, your design needs to be VR-centric. Otherwise, what's the point? For example, look at Respawn's new Medal of Honor Above and Beyond. Now, I don't want to slam this game too hard because I actually did have a lot of fun with it, but there are so many sections in the single player where you control like a turret or an anti-aircraft gun, or this one where you're controlling the cannon of a tank. Now, instead of having to manually operate the levers and point the weapon like, you do in real life, they just programmed it so that this tank weapon just points wherever your head is pointed. You look over here, the turret looks over there. You look over there, it looks over there. You just press the triggers on your controller to shoot the primary and secondary fire. This is so incredibly shallow. You might as well be sitting on a couch with an Xbox controller at this point. Compare that to Pavlov's recent World War II update, which includes tanks. Here I am manually operating the turret while my friend drives. You have to spin these red levers around. One controls the yaw and one controls the pitch. And every time you fire the gun, you have to manually unload and reload the shell. This is how you do it.
Shoot him!
There we go.
Oh my god, you tore him in half.
Now, according to Steam hardware surveys, the number of users that have VR headsets connected to their computer grew over 25% in 2020. In part, I suspect, because of COVID-19, in part because of the release of a AAA video game, but also in part because of the release of the absurdly cheap Oculus Quest 2. And that's great, but the release of the Oculus Quest 2 reveals a potentially very dark future for the virtual reality world. You see, the Oculus Quest is an untethered headset. That means it does not need to be connected to a PC to do the rendering. It has its own computer chip inside the headset itself, which is comparable to the type of hardware you're going to find in cell phones, which interestingly is good enough to do most of the VR games that are out there. But for high-end games like Alyx, Boneworks, and Medal of Honor, you'll still need to connect those headsets to a PC to do the heavy lifting. Now, untethered headsets are the future for sure, and they will continue to get smaller and more powerful. But untethered headsets create a pretty difficult problem for the VR video game industry. If you are paying for developers to make a video game, you're already taking a pretty big risk to put that game on VR headsets. Simply because the target audience really isn't that big. And if you're making a game that is specifically only for tethered headsets, that potential target audience is even smaller. So it's a much smarter business decision to make lower-end VR games to increase your potential target market. So Facebook comes along and releases an absurdly cheap untethered headset onto the market. And that basically is going to stifle any developer's plans to make higher-end tethered VR games for now. But Facebook is doing something much more sinister with virtual reality. Up until recently, you were able to log into your Oculus device using your Oculus account. Until the release of the Oculus Quest 2, when they started making it mandatory to log in with your Facebook account. Safe to say that the reason the Oculus Quest 2 is so cheap is that the data it's collecting makes up for it. The sucky thing is that most of the people buying an Oculus Quest 2 are new to VR. This is probably their first headset. And so they're unaware of what their biometric data can say about them. To them, it's like, well, who cares if Facebook knows I'm playing Beat Saber or not? Because that's the kind of tracking they're used to. First of all, Oculus Quests have microphones on them, and they have cameras that track and map your environment. But worst of all is the motion data. The motion data from your head and your hands is undoubtedly being used to create biometric profiles on Facebook users. There's a Stanford study that shows once there's a biometric profile on you that comes from this kind of motion data, both your identity and your emotional state can be determined within seconds of you using it. That is to say that if you go over to a friend's house and use their Oculus device, the motion data that it's recording is so fine-tuned that it will be able to identify who you are and how you're feeling within seconds of you putting that headset on. Biometric motion data is a literal one-to-one interpretation of your body's conscious and unconscious reactions to stimuli. So you say, okay, They can identify me and my emotional state, so what? Well, if you thought targeted ads based on your browsing history was creepy or invasive, imagine how you're going to feel when you're seeing procedurally generated and emotionally driven objects appear exactly where you're predicted to look. The manipulation will become unconscious. Facebook ads won't be about what you click on anymore. It'll be about what you look at, how long you look at it, what you don't look at. How do you act socially in VR versus alone in VR? How does this affect your emotional state? These types of biometric profiles will easily be able to be applied to real-world interactions like job placements. And that's why so many VR enthusiasts are big advocates for anonymizing this kind of biometric data. But Facebook paid $2 billion for Oculus. There's no way they're just going to sacrifice all of this data for the good of humanity. Now, I'm not trying to make anybody who owns an Oculus Quest 2 feel bad. I mean, the options right now are a $300 Oculus Quest 2 or a $1,000 Valve Index. That isn't even a competition. What we really need are more competitors, more untethered headsets that compete with the Oculus Quest 2 that have emphasis on privacy. Otherwise, people are going to keep sleepwalking into these situations where they're giving Facebook front row seats into their emotional states. The public perception of VR at that point isn't going to be very good and potentially could kill this entire medium. And if my video today has convinced you of anything, I would hope it's that VR is worth saving. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please slam that subscribe button down below. You know, when there's a big YouTuber with like 1 million subscribers, they don't even notice when people hit the subscribe button. But when there's a small YouTuber, every single time that number goes up, that brain releases dopamine. So subscribing to me is much more economical. I also now have a Discord server that you can join and come chat with me and maybe play video games. Anyway, I will see you next month.